So on August 15th, 1971, that is when Nixon closed the gold window. Of course, when he closed it, he said it was just temporary, but it's been 50 years and it hasn't reopened. But what you spoke about FDR in 1933 is true, because that's the year when the government made it illegal for Americans to own monetary gold. So American citizens could not take their Federal Reserve notes back to the Federal Reserve and get real dollars, which were made of gold. All they could do was negotiate, circulate the Federal Reserve notes. But if you were not American, if you lived outside the United States, you were still able to take your Federal Reserve notes to the Federal Reserve and actually get paid the gold that the notes promised to pay. And so that continued up until 1971. And basically what was happening in the late 1960s, early 1970s, was we started to run very big deficits in the 1960s to pay for the war in Vietnam, to pay to go to the moon, to pay for the war on poverty, and all sorts of government programs. They called it guns and butter, and we had both, yet we didn't pay for either. And so we ran these big deficits, and the Federal Reserve was then monetizing the deficits. Now we call it QE. They hadn't thought of that word back then, but that's what they were doing. So the Fed was doing QE to monetize all this government spending. We didn't have the gold, and our foreign creditors were suspicious that we didn't have enough gold to meet our obligations. So they started to show up at the gold window with their Federal Reserve notes asking for the gold. Well, we didn't have enough. And so we ended up defaulting on our obligations, because really Federal Reserve notes were promises to pay gold, and we defaulted on that promise. And so anybody who says the U.S. government has never defaulted on an obligation, that's not true. That was a massive default in 1971. And, we've been on this fiat-based monetary system ever since. And I think this system is now on the verge of an implosion. And I think we're going to see this, relatively soon, where the dollar now collapses and the world returns to the gold standard just without the dollar. Because when the world was on a dollar standard after Bretton Woods, it was because the dollar was not only backed by gold, but redeemable on demand into gold. And after we defaulted, the dollar, lost a lot of value in the 1970s, about 2/3 of its value relative to the Deutsche Mark, the yen, the Swiss franc. But it continued to serve as the reserve, and it's a reserve currency to this day. I think that status is what's in jeopardy. Well, gold is real money. And, my father taught me about gold a long time ago. In fact, before we went off the gold standard, my father was one of the few people who actually testified in front of the Senate Committee on Money and Banking against going off the gold standard. And my father was the only one that said that if we went off the gold standard, the price of gold would go up, and that the value of the dollar would go down, and that we'd have lots of inflation. All of the other government witnesses, including the then Secretary of the Treasury and the then head of the Federal Reserve, they all said that if we went off the gold standard, the price of gold, which was about $35 an ounce at the time, they said the price of gold would fall. They thought the dollar was supporting gold instead of the other way around. So they were talking about how great the economy was going to be if we can only remove the shackles of the gold standard. And my father was the only one who testified and got it right, because he laid out exactly what was going to happen in the 1970s. And it happened exactly the way he said, and the exact opposite of what the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve said. And you know what? The Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve head are just as incompetent now, maybe even more so than they were back then. They have no idea the damage that they have unleashed from their policies, especially the mistakes that they've made since COVID. I mean, the Federal Reserve has done everything wrong since COVID. And despite the fact that everybody is praising them for what they did, remember, everybody praised them for all the bailouts and all the stimulus following 2008. And they praised them when they bailed everything out after the dot-com bubble popped. But all those were policy mistakes. What the Federal Reserve should have done following the outbreak of COVID was withdraw money from circulation, allow interest rates to go up. Because the problem with COVID, and I said this at the time, was a supply problem. People were leaving their jobs. Companies were shutting down. People were staying home. They weren't working. They weren't producing goods. They weren't providing services. So we had a lot less stuff to buy. What the Federal Reserve needed to do was reduce the money supply so that money supply went down with goods supply. Instead, they did the opposite. They flooded the economy with money. They printed all this money and sent it out to everybody. So what happened? We increased demand while we were decreasing supply. That's why you're seeing this huge increase in consumer prices right now.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race, you're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I intend, how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.